How's it going, everybody? I built a mini logging trailer. Believe it or not, this is actually a very straightforward project. It should be something anybody could duplicate, so if you want to see how it was built, go ahead and follow along. So believe it or not, this entire build cost me less than $100 to put together, and part of the reason is because I got a couple of these old parts for free. The base of the entire project is this old trailer, and the first thing to do was to start taking it apart. Now, to understand why I got this trailer for free, you'll have to know a little bit about Mark. My mom got remarried to Mark a couple of years ago, and Mark is a Jeep guy. Not only is he a Jeep guy, but he's the quintessential Jeep guy, kind of like the king of Jeep guys. Do you remember when I told you a couple of months ago that I went off the road during a snowstorm and ended up in a ditch? One of the things I didn't tell you about is how I got out. I never really let on exactly how intense that situation really was, and this is the only photo I got of it. This is me at the bottom of a 15-foot hill. Now, of course, as soon as Mark heard that I was stuck at the bottom of the hill, he dropped everything he was doing that day and drove right out with his Jeep and winched me out. And I gotta tell you, I was really stuck in there, but he pulled that car out like it was a dang Matchbox car. It seems surprisingly easy for him and his truck. So that's the kind of guy Mark is. Now, a couple of years ago, Mark was in the market for a new trailer, and he wanted to get rid of this old one. And there's so many things on here that need to be repaired that he decided, instead of repairing it and trying to sell it, he decided he would just give it to me because I was in the market for a smaller one. And on top of that, I was asking him about his opinion on winches and what I should be looking for to build a logging trailer, and he told me, you know, I got this extra one in my garage, do you just want it? So basically, I got this winch and the trailer for free from Mark. So thank you, Mark. This is fantastic. So if you could all do me a favor and write thanks, Mark, in the comments so that he can go down and read all that, because he is the main reason I was able to do this project. Thanks, Mark. Now, I did end up giving him one of the walnut slabs that I milled up a couple of months ago. Those things are finally out of the kiln, and they are amazing. So I will have to do an update on those. Mark has done a handful of slab projects over the last couple of years, so I figured it'd be pretty cool to give him the first one of the batch. Now, I, on the other hand, am the farthest thing from a Jeep guy. I have never worked with a winch before, and I've definitely never installed one, but this is what I decided to do. I have the winch bolted to this metal plate, and I have the metal plate bolted down to the frame of the trailer using these U-bolts. Now, I have used this a little bit over the last week or so, and it seems to be holding just fine. I'm really not worried about these U-bolts holding. And based on the sounds that this winch is making, I would expect the winch to actually break before any of these bolts would. But let me know how you would connect these, because like I said, I've never done one of these before, so I would love any suggestions you have. The U-bolts that I originally bought to mount the winch turned out to be a little bit too short, but I was able to use them here to mount this piece of wood. The only reason I wanted this piece of wood on here is because it was going to make it a lot easier to mount other things to the trailer, such as this controller box. And then I decided to mount the switch as far away from the winch as possible so I could try to keep away from all of the dangers. Now, being a new winch owner, I really don't know a ton about how to run a winch safely. I know that there's dangers of the cable snapping and things like that, so if there's any advice you guys have down in the comments, that would be fantastic. I've only done a handful of research so far. Now, the front of this trailer is not actually plywood like the sides are. It's a thick piece of sheet metal. And so this part of the installation was actually really easy. I just cut a square hole to fit these rollers and then just bolted right to the sheet metal. And it seems to be working just fine. If this was made out of any other material, this probably would have been a much more complicated build, so I kind of lucked out on that one. And then I went through and I zip-tied all the cables down to keep them out of the way. At one point in this winch's life, it was used as a direct drive for some sort of Jeep-related mechanism. I'm not really sure what it was. And so Mark had welded this gear to it. I fully intended on leaving the gear intact, but it turned out that it was in the way, so I had to remove a part of it so that I could use it as a winch still. Now, if you're wondering how I used an angle grinder in such a tight space without nicking this cable, I didn't. I actually did nick the cable pretty bad, but it's okay because I had to remove about 10 feet of this cable anyway, because with this gear on here, it actually has a lesser capacity for all the cable, and I can't put all the cable on, so I had to remove some cable anyway, so everything just kind of worked out. And right here is where I learned that it's really easy to tangle the cable on these things. I'm not really sure what the right way to handle this is, but I sure did make a mess a couple times. Does everyone else just run the cable all tangled like this? I was trying to dress it on here as nice as I could. And then the last step for the winch portion of the build is just to install the hook. That went pretty straightforward. I did end up moving these rollers down a little bit so that the cable wasn't riding on that top bar anymore. Now, other than the winch, there's really only one other part you gotta think about if you're gonna be making one of these log arch trailers, and that is the arch. Keep in mind most people make these out of metal, but I wanted to keep this as cheap as possible. So what I decided to do instead of welding a bunch of pieces together was to get a bunch of these 1x4s and layer them up so that you have this sort of manufactured finger joint in the corners. And that way what I ended up with was essentially 4x4 posts all the way around the arch, and then I could reinforce those in the corners. I also used this as an opportunity to do a TikTok live event, so I built this entire arch over there on TikTok. If you're not following me over there yet, you need to, because it is a ton of fun over there. It's so much fun having all the interaction with people over there on TikTok. It's something that you don't really get over here on YouTube. I highly recommend following me over there if you're interested in sort of the behind the scenes stuff. And let me know in the comments if you are one of my followers from TikTok. I would love to know how much overlap there is between these two channels. The pivot point for this log arch is pretty straightforward. All I did was drill a hole so that I could place a pipe into, and then later on I can put a threaded rod through there and it acts as a pivot point without destroying the wood. The other part of this hinge mechanism is going to be 4 2x6 pieces, and because I'm going to be moving a lot of heavy logs past them, I had to cut this 45-degree angle on them. That part will make a little bit more sense once the trailer is together. And then I needed one hole in each of these that's going to hold the other part of the threaded rod. Now I needed some sort of way of attaching these to the trailer themselves, and what I came up with was just drilling a hole all the way through these 2x6s so that I could place a threaded rod through them and bolt them directly to the trailer. Here's a better look at the framing pieces that I failed to get footage of earlier. These are just some 2x6s set at a 45-degree angle, and they're just there to add a little bit more support to the log arch. Now because the winch needs something to pull against that's incredibly sturdy, I decided to add a couple more layers of material here, not only to add more rigidity, but to also give a little bit more stability and strength to this eye bolt that I'm about to put through. This whole log arch is constructed the same way. It's all just made up of layers of construction material glued together with a Titebond 3, which means the joints should be waterproof. And then to add a little bit more rigidity, it's also screwed together. I use these 3-inch screws wherever possible. And then I can fill any gaps and clean up all of the wood glue with the sawdust. And then I can give the entire thing a good once-over with a sander. And then I can finally paint it using whatever I could find in my cabinet at the time. This first layer I'm just treating as a primer, and I decided to paint it green because that's what I had, and then I went over 2 more coats with this matte black. And then after I was done painting, I went over the entire thing once more with this flooring varnish. I think when I was done I did about 3 coats of this. I really don't care if this finish is perfect, I just wanted it coated as thick as I could. I cut down a bunch of pieces of this threaded rod, and you can kind of see how this is starting to fit together. The threaded rod goes through the first hinge block and then through the log arch and then another hinge block. And then the other side gets another washer and nut on the end. I decided to put lock nuts on either side so that the hinge can stay nice and loose, and then I could cut off the excess. The last piece to install on this before it's done is the eye bolt. This is the piece that's going to allow me to connect the arch to the winch so that the entire thing can operate. Because of how much material I had to drill through here, I had to do it in 2 passes, but it was really easy to get a nice square hole using my homemade mobile drill press. And then I can install the eye bolt and the log arch is done. Now all I need to do is figure out how to carry this thing out to the trailer and get it installed on there. It really isn't that heavy, it's just kind of awkward to carry. Now there was probably a much easier way of doing this, but I decided to just kind of lean it back really far and jam the legs into place. It took me a few tries, but I was able to do it. And then I could see how everything was working and see if I got all my measurements correct.
Oh, that's perfect!
Now I intentionally didn't leave myself very much room on the sides, and so the nut sticks out on the side and had to be pushed through the side of the trailer. Like I said, this is mostly rotten wood, so I don't really care too much about how it looks. And then I needed to start drilling holes directly through the floorboards of the trailer. On this left side I'm only drilling through wood, and that should be able to hold just fine, but the real hold comes from the holes on the right. It's hard to show exactly, but I am drilling through a piece of frame here. It's a pretty thick piece of angle iron, and this is what's going to be adding most of my support. To mount these to the trailer, I decided to use 4 long pieces of threaded rod. Some of these were giving me a ton of trouble and I had to hammer them into place, but some of the other ones went straight in using the drill. But eventually I got everything firmly connected. I did buy some washers to put on top of this at one point. I was worried that these were going to rip through the wood, but the washers were interfering with the log arch, so I decided not to use them. By the time I finished the log arch, the sun had already gone down, so I wasn't able to get a lot of footage that night. But the next day, I was finally able to connect the winch to the log arch and start a few tests. And I gotta say, this thing works a lot better than I expected it was going to. I mean, of course I had high hopes for this thing, but I never really know for sure how well something's gonna work until you actually see it in action. And I gotta say, I was pretty impressed with how well this thing worked. Now, one of the things that Mark had mentioned in passing is that the easiest way to connect a winch is using jumper cables. It's probably not something you want to keep doing in the long run, but for right now, this is how I'm connecting it. These jumper cables are just barely long enough to be able to reach the winch. Now, the way these trailers operate is actually very straightforward. You just back the trailer up to whatever you want to lift and wrap a strap around it and pull it as tight as you can. And then when you pull on it with the winch, it pulls the log in sort of this arch motion, loading it automatically onto the trailer. I've found that changing the variables, such as where you're grabbing a log and how far away you are from the log when you start, changes how easy it is for it to load. So there is a bit of a learning curve, but it's really not too complicated. And then when you get them most of the way loaded, you can switch over to just using the winch as a winch. I decided with this first test, I wanted to just weigh it down as much as I could by grabbing 3 logs at the same time, and this includes the heaviest log I had on the property at the time. Considering how small this trailer is, I really don't think I'm going to be picking up anything too massive that this arch isn't going to be able to handle. I figure anything that I'm going to be able to fit into this trailer and through the archway is probably going to be light enough that this winch should be able to manage it just fine. And that's the logging trailer. Thank y'all for watching. Now keep in mind, I am very green when it comes to things like winches and this log arch, and so let me know if you have any expertise of this kind of stuff down in the comments. I would love to hear any suggestions or ideas you guys might have, so thank y'all for watching. Catch y'all next time.